Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Tallberg Foundation podcast. I am Lars Trägårdh, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at tallbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World. Big events, wars, depressions, technological transformations, outstandingly good or bad leaders can change how countries work, how citizens relate to governments, as well as to each other. Think before and after the overthrow of the Shah, a modernizing monarchy becomes a harsh theocracy. Even short of such a radical scenario, the core of what people get from and give to those who govern them changes over time. Arguably, the more stable the social contract, the more accepted and honored by both the people and their leaders, the more likely citizens will experience peace and prosperity, which, of course, is the whole point of having governments in the first place. My guest today on New Thinking for a New World is Swedish historian Lars Trägårdh. He brings an unusual background to thinking about this whole idea of social contract and the cohesion of societies, having spent his career living and working in the United States as well as in Sweden, where today he's a professor at Uppsala University. He also published a book last year, which is worth reading, but it's nowhere near as good as the title, The Swedish Theory of Love. Fabulous title, however. Lars can think about America like an American, but also like a European and vice versa. Welcome, Lars, to New Thinking for a New World.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Let me start with your perceptions of what's going on in the U.S. I know you've been in America repeatedly during the past year, but what we got is deep polarization, even deeper distrust of virtually all institutions, people consistently telling pollsters that the country's headed in the wrong direction. They fear for their children's futures. They worry about economics, even if the numbers tell them they shouldn't worry about economics. Where's the rough, tough Marlboro man when we need him?
Yes. No, it's a very good question. I'm quite worried myself because, of course, I'm not just simply a foreign observer of the U.S. I'm someone who's lived there 40 years. My wife is American. My kids are dual citizens. So, for me, this is a personal matter as well as an academic question. And I am, deeply worried about it because it does seem to be an absence really of some figure that could come in and do, in a sense, what Biden promised to do, but has not really managed to do, namely to be some sort of unifier, right, in the country, reestablishing trust across the aisle, so to speak, trying to create a better impression of Washington, of government, of the common institutions. Instead, what we have seen over these last few years is a deepening of that gulf between, parts of America. And this is nothing like the U.S. was when I arrived in 1970, even back then, right, there were deep political conflicts, of course. But there was a sense that we were all in the same boat. There was some idea of being an American that was a unifying idea. And it's hard right now to see that. One certainly hopes that this figure will show up and that it will be able to be a force to be reckoned with. But it's difficult at this moment to give a very optimistic and clear answer to your question.
I saw some data recently from the Edelman people who asked the following question. Does the social fabric that once held your country together grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose? 64% of the people responded that they polled extensively in the United States responded, yep, the social fabric that I think I remember, put aside whether it really existed, isn't there anymore. That's scary stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the scary statistics I've seen also is that people don't seem to want to marry, right, across political party lines, right? It used to be that one asked questions about could you marry someone outside of your own ethnic group. Now it seems to be that people are not willing to consider relationships across the political lines. And that tells you something about a social contract that is really breaking down, not just at the level of politics, but, in the realm of personal social life as well. And that's very serious.
So you're a historian. Why is it breaking down? Why are we where we are?
I think that's a very good question, Alan, because the thing is that people sometimes today, right, people have short memories and people are sort of thinking about what's happened in the last 10 years. But, let's face it, the U.S. after the Second World War was a pretty unified place. There was a strong sense of social cohesion. That's when we have the first studies of social trust. And the U.S. at that time was a high trust society comparable to what we see in the Nordic countries still today. So there was a sense that we are all in the same boat. You had these huge investments in big chunks of the population, the GI Bill, the building of this university system in states like California and many other states for that matter. A sense that we have a common duty to make social investments, to make sure that we ensure social mobility for the maximum amount of Americans so that, the beauty of the American dream is alive and well and continues into the next generation or two. So this was an America that existed not terribly long ago. So we cannot just simply say that, American Constitution, is anti-majoritarian. It tends to promote divisions and incapacity to rule and govern. That's too simple. There is, to be sure, a long-term perspective that has to do with the political culture rooted, in fact, in the Constitution. But there's also a shorter perspective, a story about a pretty well-functioning system, a social contract, a political system that worked pretty well, even though it, of course, allowed, like any democracy, for conflicts and divisions and, different kinds of meanings on certain types of topics. But certainly nobody would have talked in the 1950s and 60s and well into the 70s and maybe even to the 80s about the possibility of the end of democracy in the United States, which today is a topic that people speak about quite seriously.
So a couple of years ago, as you know, Robert Putnam wrote his book, Bowling Alone, which essentially was about the breakdown of social institutions, which had been so important. And that's everything from garden clubs to the Boy Scouts to non-governmental institutions. These are really almost clubs, if you will, which was a very important part of how Americans organized themselves. The other very important piece of social cohesion in the United States had always been the nuclear family, much more so than in many other countries. Not the extended family, a la Italy, but the nuclear family. Today, 40% of births are outside of a two-parent family. That nuclear family doesn't exist in the way that it did in the time period you're talking about, pre-2000 for sure. So we've lost both social institutions and families as anchor tenants in our social cohesion. Two questions, I guess. Three questions. Is that a fair description? Two, is it reversible? And three, if not, then what?
Yeah, well, let me try to approach this question from actually a Swedish point of view or Nordic point of view, right? The Nordic countries are high trust countries. They have, a fairly well functioning society. Sweden is under pressure. We can get back to that because I think it's pertinent, to thinking about the U.S. But the interesting thing right here is that when it comes to Putnam, right, that you brought up, Putnam, of course, hugely influential and important thinker, one of the probably most well-known public intellectuals for a long time. But the Swedes, tend to quarrel with his analysis because they see, right, that Sweden also have very high rates, right, of divorce. We've had, a long history, in fact, right, of not having sort of built, our social contract around the more traditional family, right, or nuclear family for that matter, nor really around institutions that are often brought up in discussions about the health of America, let's say, the religious communities, right? And so there is a little bit of a sense that a Swede would probably react, right, to this and say, no, the problem is not the decline of the family, right? It's not really even the decline of religion or other types of organizations in civil society. It is the failure, right, of the common institutions to service, right, the population as a whole and work, right, to create that sense of a stability in social contract. And I brought up already, right, that in the glory days of the post-war United States, there was much more of a presence of these kinds of well-functioning, well-funded institutions that aimed, right, to provide some degree of equal opportunity to people. There was even a discussion, as you know, during FDR, right, of having a universal healthcare system, right? It was actually quite close at a certain point. And certainly when it came to education, there was a sense that this is something that's so important that all kids in America should have access to this. This is so critical. And those institutions, they serve to create a sense of commonality, right, among people as well, right, as de facto, in a material sense, providing opportunities for everybody. And I think that what is really worrisome from the point of view of a Nordic is the failures here, right, the kind of demonization, if you will, of the state, and a kind of almost a romantic glorification of the family, and which makes then the whole narrative about the decline of the family, the decline of religion, it seem plausible, right, to many Americans in the public debate. But for a Scandinavian, I think one would say, well, look, we are the most secular country in the world. So certainly religion cannot be an explanatory factor here, right? And we sort of don't have like families that are particularly, we have highly individualistic. The book that you mentioned that I wrote is really about individualism, social trust, right? The kind of paradox that Sweden is both the most individualistic country in the world and, is characterized by social values. Now that goes back to these institutions, right? And a positive view of the state, right? That we are the highest tax country in the world, but still there is no anti-tax political party, which to an American, right, would seem to be utter inexplicable. But the problem in the U.S. now is that it's gone so far, if you will, right? You've had a Republican Party that has been sort of working on what they call starving the beast, meaning, right, to try to deprive the state of the kind of resources necessary to make the type of investments in the population that is necessary, both for wealth production, social mobility, and ultimately for social cohesion. So I think one of the missing pieces of the conversation there revolves around the common institutions in the U.S. And there's a little too much talk, I think, right, about family as well as religion and other institutions in civil society. And I think that's where most Swedish political scientists would quarrel with Putnam's analysis, right, because we are bringing our own experience into that analysis. And they are family and civil society organization, even though they are very vibrant in Sweden as well, but they are not viewed as the only crucial element, right? They are there together. They are part of the institutional infrastructure, right? But so are the public institutions.
Let me just challenge one bit of that, which objectively the facts are that we're spending dramatically more in the public sector than we ever have. So whether or not there is rhetoric around about starving the beast, right. The beast is fat, dumb, and happy.
Yeah. Well,
dumber and happier than it's ever been, in fact, in any comparison to the modern period. But to your point, though, there is a strong sense that the institutions aren't working. 50% of kids in New York City public schools are functionally illiterate for their age level. That's a failure of a school system that is phenomenal. I mean, it's literally off the charts. Curiously, during the pandemic, and I want to switch, you've mentioned the pandemic, I want to switch a bit to the pandemic in the sense that during the pandemic, for emergency reasons, the United States put in place a whole plethora of new social programs, dramatic expansion of childcare, of healthcare, obviously, of support of students, et cetera, et cetera. It was perceived as an emergency response, and it's now being unwound, much to the chagrin of those who would prefer to see a more Swedish, if I may, kind of social safety net versus a more traditionally American social safety net, which is viewed not as necessary. It's viewed as necessary in an emergency, but not on a day-to-day basis. It's a fundamental difference between Sweden on the one hand, the United States on the other hand.
I think that's a fair description. And I think that speaks exactly, I think, to the key issue here. And I think that there's a perceptional problem here that also goes actually to the way Americans think about the Nordic countries. You use the word welfare and welfare state, which in American English has rather negative connotations, right? Like welfare queens, right? Money for nothing, right? A kind of a sort of a support system, a safety net, right? Itself kind of captures that. Whereas in Sweden today, you are talking more about a social investment state, right? We remember the Nordic countries are extraordinarily successful market societies, right? These are not like socialism, right? I mean, we have had very few experiments actually in sort of kind of traditional socialism in terms of taking over companies. And these are very vibrant market societies. So the key here is that the state's role is perceived here of making investments, right? And, you brought them up yourself here during the pandemic in the U.S. It was interesting to see that you'd put money, into childcare, very important form of investment, because it translates into, human beings that are going to be much more able to function in a competitive market society. Healthcare, right? I mean, healthcare is a huge cost to a lot of American companies. It's not a particularly great and rational system that you have right now there. But it's an investment, right? I usually say that the Swedish state functions as a social insurance, right? On the one hand, and an investment bank on the other, right? So the idea is you invest, in young people so that they can be providers, successful part of the economy. The social contract in Sweden is very straightforward. People work, pay taxes, earn rights. In some ways, right, the Nordic welfare state is more of a Republican wet dream than it is really some sort of democratic fantasy, because it's based on a very harsh moral logic, right? Everybody has to work and contribute. Nothing is for free. There are no free lunches available, right? And I think that logic, is sort of not really present enough, right, in a discussion in the U.S., right? You don't want a system that is based on sort of handouts. Clearly, this is destructive to the moral order, destructive to the people who receive those handouts. So the important thing is, if you're going to do something with state institutions, it has to be viewed as investments, right? And I think here, it would be good if there was sort of a change in the conversational tone and the language, both when it comes to comparing Sweden or the U.S. to the other Nordic countries, but also internally in the discussion about institutional frameworks and logics in the United States itself.
Thanks for listening so far. I hope you're enjoying the conversation as much as I have. If you haven't already, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and rate us on Apple Podcast. Now back to today's discussion, sponsored by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, SNF. As you were talking, one of the thoughts that comes to mind that has troubled me for some time is that the U.S. may simply be too big and too diverse to cope with the challenges of our era. You suggested the decline of religion in the United States. In fact, 30% of Americans report they go to church every week. That's a third of the nation. That's pretty high for an industrial country. I suspect it's an outlier for an industrial country. It used to be a little bit higher. It used to be 40% for years, but it's still a third of the nation. I suspect most of that third does not live on either the East Coast or the West Coast, that there's an internal company. It's like one of these jelly donuts. There's America in between, and there's the coasts. And you see that kind of division reflected in all sorts of things, including big picture politics and little picture politics. So the question, I'm trying to form a question here. We may just be, there's too many countries here. Maybe they're not governable. Maybe this national model, the combination of federalism and a strong national government, has reached the limits of its possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can't really argue with your analysis. I mean, I think there's a lot of good reasons to worry along those lines. All I'm saying is that if you look at the actual history in the U.S., right, there's also been quite a lot of evidence to the contrary, right? I mean, to be sure, you can argue that the U.S. today is sort of more diverse and more divided than it was before. But it wasn't as if the United States in the 1950s, right, was a country devoid of diversity. It has always had this kind of rich pluralism that's been, part of the strength of American society, clearly. But there was a different sort of a balance, right, between, a sort of a capacity to solve problems collectively that worked for most of the population on the one hand, and then, still allowing for a pluralism, right, when it came to, let's say, religion or ethnic communities and so forth. The worry today is like that the divisions themselves are sort of fed. They're feeding further, right, divisions.
Lars, we're talking during what the United Nations has declared as Climate Week, which seems to be most in occasions for lots of people to fly to New York, talk about climate, worry that we're not doing enough. But that's my cynical reaction. But the changing climate clearly is one of the existential challenges of our time. Can our societies, by which I mean the U.S. and separately Sweden and Europe, can our societies, as they're now structured, handle what it looks like the science demands of us?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I say that, I think Sweden and U.S. find themselves in slightly different positions here. Some of that has to do with just sheer size. U.S. is tremendously important here, and so is, of course, China, because just simply for the reason that the impact is so much greater, right? So there is, for example, a discussion in Sweden represented by the Sweden Democrats, which is sort of the political party on the right here, that the big challenge is to get the Chinese to do their part here, right? And what Sweden does is really, to some extent, much less relevant. Right? At the same time, there is a pretty unified support, across the board that, we need to do our part here. So there's relatively little, kind of opposition, let's say, to trying to address these questions. There's a lot of, political will to do the right thing, whatever that may be. So I think there is a kind of an easier way here to do something politically with respect to reining in, right, emissions and so forth, than in the U.S. At the same time, there is also a sense that Sweden is not the key player here, right? The Nordic countries can do a certain amount, but at the end of the day, even if those countries were to do everything right, if the U.S., China, India, and so forth don't get their act together, we're all going to be, frying in hell anyway. So there is a sort of a sense here of not having, the reins in your hands, right? We are not the key players here. So that I think is a big difference. At the same time, there are some similarities, right? You have the questions about short-term costs and long-term gains. Are you going to be able to stop, driving cars tomorrow? No, you're not going to be able to do that. Are you going to sacrifice everything associated with a good modern life and everybody go bicycling and sort of kind of having their own vegetable gardens? No, that's not going to happen either. So there is a sort of a sense that we have to think about these things long terms. But I think the political will is there in a different way, right, than in the US, where the divisions, again, the stuff that you and I already talked about, they are so severe that it's almost at the level when you think back on the pandemic, right? That Sweden chose a different way, but there was no debate about vaccinations, right? There were no anti-vaxxers around. You didn't have a deep political polarization around, those policies. And it's the same thing, with the environment. Yes, you do have some people at the outer edges, right, of the political spectrum, right, that may be climate deniers, but it's a very, very small group of people. So it's not the same political challenge, I think, as you have in the U.S.
But that's exactly the point. In the U.S., as you pointed out a couple of times, everything is partisan. Everything is polarized. We have a climate emergency, but emergencies aren't the sorts of thing that you do anything about in that politically tense, politically confrontational kind of mode. So again, not trying to put you on the spot, but I am trying to put you on the spot. Do you, as someone who knows America as well as you do, but from your own unique perspective, think the nation is capable of coping with this in any sort of reasonable way of what's being asked of the United States and the rest of the world?
Alan, I think there's one perspective here, perhaps, right, that may make a difference. That is to say that the impact of climate change, right, so far in Sweden has been extremely minimal, right? We can still have jokes about, we're going to have vineyards soon. Isn't that a great thing? Our summers are going to be longer. Isn't that wonderful? In the U.S., the situation is different, right? You have had some pretty horrific events here from a climate perspective. The fires, right? The floods, the issues about, the availability of clean water and so forth. These are real issues at a certain point, right? I think that in the U.S., that is going to perhaps provoke the coming of together of people in a different way. So that would be my one bit of hopefulness here, that the situation is already this year has been severe enough in the U.S. That people have to kind of start to take it serious. It's hard to be a climate change denier in the U.S., given just the sort of the magnitude of what is actually happening. So that would be, the one little bit of edge, right? It's a tragic edge, right? But it's a certain advantage in the U.S., right, to actually facing, climate change in a direct, concrete way that might prompt political action even across the political lines.
And unfortunately, the only problem is there are virtually no actions that have any impact in the short run. Those actions are all multi-generational consequences. And I at least would be stunned if the American political system is capable of making decisions that would have consequence in 40 years, but the costs are now. It's the exact opposite of how our politics in the United States tends to work. Let me just shift finally to perhaps a funny place, tolerance. You recently published an article and referenced Karl Popper's book from the 30s, in which he presented the tolerance paradox, that tolerant societies may have to become intolerant at the margins to sustain their tolerance. Does that apply, do you think, to the United States in the 21st century, given everything we've talked about?
Well, I think the U.S. Ultimately, is facing a similar conundrum, of course. I think that when you think about America, right, the United States, there's always been this interesting kind of duality, right? On the one hand, you also, like in Sweden, have made tolerance as a key value, right, in American democracy, in fact. But at the same time, you've also had, for immigrants, this tradition of swearing an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. Right? So there has been a very clear sense of a kind of civil religion, right? As Rousseau famously called it.
In God we trust. In God we trust is on our currency. It's on our courthouses. It's
well, but that is interesting because that, is in some ways also some historians argue that actually the preoccupation with God, has actually come a little bit later, whereas the actual, commitment to the Constitution, right, has been there, as a very central part for a really longer period of time. And that actually what we see now as a threat to that is what some people refer to as Christian nationalism in the United States, right? Where the argument is forget about the separation of state and church. America is a Christian nation, and this goes, this is actually of a higher standing than, just a mere secular constitution. So U.S. is facing a challenge there as well, that it takes the form of intolerance. And the question is, can the U.S. handle that, right, by creating a sort of limit to tolerance? How far are we going to go placating, right, the claims and demands from the religious right? And that is analogous to demands that you see in Sweden and some other Western European countries, right, where sizable Muslim minorities, right, are subject, right, to sort of a political program that, is trying to argue that, the religious beliefs associated with the Quran or with Islam, right, are of a higher standing, so to speak, right, than the secular laws of these countries. And that's where I was coming down when I was writing this piece, right, that what we see now in Sweden, which has now somewhere around 25% foreign born, many of them coming, from Muslim countries. These issues are real now in a way that they weren't before. So tolerance is not just merely an abstract concept, right? It's something that is actually challenged in the concrete when it comes to, the laws of the land, so to speak. But I think that U.S. and Sweden both have these kinds of issues that are deep issues because, it's easy to say we should respect all religions. But it's quite a different matter to say that means, therefore, that we're going to have special rules applying for people who are religious when it comes to the laws of the land. And issues like abortion, for example, right, has already become an issue. We see how, religion has become a different type of issue on the Supreme Court in the United States recently, right? So, the kind of demands and the challenges coming from the religious right is something that actually also does challenge, right, the primacy of the U.S. as a constitutional order of a secular kind.
Let's leave it there because I'd love to open that door. That is the potential constitutional crisis or maybe crises that could be in America's future. We'll save that for next time because I think it would be worthwhile exploring how the United States might cope with these issues and potentially cope with whether it needs a new constitution to cope with the new world we live in. So, Lars Trägårdh, I want to thank you very much for this conversation and look forward to our next chat.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at tallbergfoundation.org.